So this video about trigonometry is an introduction, right? I don't know how much trigonometry you've ever had in your life, but you're about to get a whole bunch. So trigonometry, these are 3 of the 6 words of trigonometry. Okay, the sine, the cosine, and the tangent. Okay, and what you need to know about these is these are all ratios. Okay, they are comparisons of sides of your triangles. Okay, the sine, the cosine, and the tangent. Now, when you're looking at your calculator, you're going to see this word. Okay, this is not church. That's pronounced sine. Right, that is an abbreviation for the word sine. It is not sin. It is sine. So you're talking about the sine of an angle. And this is cosine, and this is the tangent. Okay, and these are all ratios of 2 sides of your triangle. Okay, and these are the 3 sides that you're talking about. For any given angle, you have 3 sides. So the first thing we're going to do is identify the sides of your triangle. Okay, are we talking about the opposite side, the adjacent side, or the hypotenuse? And then this guy here, this is an acronym that we're going to use in order to set up the ratios correctly. Okay, if you ask a parent or somebody what they remember about geometry, they might say that. Okay, it's sometimes pronounced SOHCAHTOA, SOHCAHTOA or SOHCAHTOA. I don't know whether you're from the East Coast or the West Coast or from Germany or South America. Who knows? Anyway, let's talk about some symbols. We're going to use a lot of Greek letters to name angles. Okay, as well as uppercase and lowercase letters. Right? Uppercase letters are for points and corners. Lowercase letters are for lines and segments. So here are some commonly used Greek letters that we're going to have. Okay, alpha. Okay, it looks like that, right? Little fish. Beta, and then the Y-looking thing is called gamma. And then this one is, I believe, phi, pho. Sigma, I don't know, looks like a lowercase sigma. But most often we're going to use alpha and beta, as well as, of course, X, Y, and Z, A, B, and C, and all those other things. Okay, so naming angles, or rather naming sides. The blank side is always across from the angle we are referencing. Okay, so you're not always going to be given the same angle, and definitely not always in the same orientation. Right? These things can change, they can move, they can be repositioned. So the reference angle is either the angle that you're given or the angle that we're trying to find. Okay? And the one that is across from the reference angle is known as the opposite side. Okay, the opposite side is across from the reference angle. Opposite side. Okay, it does not touch the 2 chords of your angle in any way. So the opposite side is across from. The adjacent side goes here, the adjacent side, ADJACENT. The adjacent side touches the angle. And of course, the last one is the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse doesn't change. The hypotenuse is always the hypotenuse. It's always across from the 90-degree angle. So let's see if we can name these sides. So here is our triangle. This is your reference angle, right? This is the angle alpha. So for this reference angle alpha, which one of these 3 sides is the hypotenuse? And hopefully you are saying this side in your head. The hypotenuse is, of course, across from the 90-degree angle. Okay, and what side is your adjacent side? Hopefully you're saying this one down here. Okay, so the reference angle here, the reference angle is made up of your adjacent side and your hypotenuse. Your angle is formed by the adjacent side and the hypotenuse. Okay, the angle is formed by the adjacent side and the hypotenuse. So if this is our angle, right, this is your reference angle, alpha. It's made up of the hypotenuse, which is obvious, hopefully, and the adjacent side. which means what is the name of this side over here across from the reference angle? The opposite side. So we have the opposite side, the hypotenuse, and the adjacent side. Okay, so identifying which sides are which, that's the first important thing to do. So here, now we're talking about beta, and our reference angle is up here. Okay, so your orientation has changed. So what is your hypotenuse? Hopefully that's not a hard question. This side is the hypotenuse, and we're just going to shorthand it with hype. And what is the other side that makes up your angle? The adjacent side. So your adjacent side and your hypotenuse side make up your angle, which means now this side here is your opposite side. Okay, so identifying what sides we have is the first key to be able to doing these trig problems correctly. So I want you to take a minute and do these last two ones, and we'll come back and give you the answers soon. So there we have these two triangles. The hypotenuse and the adjacent side make up your reference angle. Okay, so now let's talk about the ratios. The sine ratio compares two sides of your triangle. It compares the opposite side and the hypotenuse. Okay, the sine compares the opposite side and the hypotenuse. Opposite and hypotenuse. Okay, the cosine compares the adjacent side and the hypotenuse. And the tangent compares the opposite side and the adjacent side. So depending on what two sides you have in your problem, you're going to use one of these three specific trig ratios that relates those two sides. So if you have the adjacent side and the hypotenuse, you're going to be using the cosine function. If you have the opposite side and the adjacent side, you're going to be using the tangent function. So being able to identify what sides you have is going to help us set up and solve your trig ratios. Okay, so let's look at the back page and see what we have there. So we use a mnemonic, NME mnemonic. SOHCAHTOA, right? So it's S-O-H. So think about it this way. Well, I don't know if you think about it this way, whatever. The sine is the opposite and the hypotenuse. So that's what SOH stands for. Sine, opposite, hypotenuse. Cosine, adjacent, hypotenuse. S-O-H-C-A-H, and then T-O-A. Okay, sine is S, cosine is C, tangent is T, and then O is opposite, H is hypotenuse, and A is adjacent. So it can look like that. Okay, I don't know how some people like to write it as. I think everybody writes it like that. I guess maybe it could look like this. Sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, tangent is opposite over adjacent. That looks pretty busy, but that is how we're going to write our ratios anyway. So SOHCAHTOA, S-O-H-C-A-H-T-O-A. SOHCAHTOA. Okay, now let's actually get to doing some of these works. Well, no, let's do that. Let's talk about the ratios first before we do anything else. Okay, so here are your trig ratios. The sine of an angle. Okay, remember A is an angle. This is where the angle goes. So if our angle is 75, it's the sine of 75. If your angle is 10, it's the sine of 10. So the sine of angle, the sine of the angle, the sine ratio is found by looking at the opposite side and dividing it by the hypotenuse side. Okay, the cosine of your angle, right, whatever your angle is named, alpha, beta, A, B, X, Y, Z, right, it can be named lots of things. The cosine is a ratio of the adjacent side, so adjacent divided by the hypotenuse. Remember, a ratio is a comparison that we can write as a fraction. So we're going to write them all as fractions. And then the tangent of your angle, and these are all going to be in degrees, by the way, at the moment. So these are all degrees. The tangent is the opposite side divided by the adjacent side. So one of these three things, well, today, either your opposite side or your hypotenuse is going to be a variable. Right? One of these ratios is going to be a variable today because we're trying to figure out what the side length is. So we're going to know the angle, we're going to know one side, and we're going to be looking for a second side. That's our goal in using trigonometry. We can use trig when we know an angle and one side. Okay, an angle and one side. Those special right triangles were only good if it were 30 or 60 or 45. This is good for everything else in the world, which is why it's very universal. So let's see. What do we got to do? Number one, solve for x. Okay, so we have a 25-degree reference angle. So let's first identify our sides. What side is your hypotenuse? The 10 is your hypotenuse. And what side is x? X is the opposite side, right? This is the side. This is the adjacent side. The adjacent side and the hypotenuse make up your angle. So do we know the adjacent side? Do we know what the length of the adjacent side is? No. So this is not important to our problem right now. So the first question is, which trig ratio relates the opposite side and the hypotenuse? Which trig ratio relates opposite and hypotenuse? The sine does. So the first thing we do is we identify which trig relates these two things, and we write that down. Sine. Sine is the trig ratio that relates them. Sine of what? Sine of the angle. So sine of 25 equals. Sine 25 equals. Right? And then we make a fraction. Opposite. What side is the opposite side in our triangle? X. X is the opposite side. And what side is the hypotenuse? 10. Okay? On every single problem we're going to do, and on your test, this is what you need to write down first. Write down the trig ratio. Okay, this is a trig ratio. It has three parts. It has a trig word. It has a trig angle. And then it has a ratio, right? A comparison of the correct two sides. So now we're going to solve this. So here's our algebra part. We have an x in a numerator. Okay, and if x is in the numerator, we want to get rid of the 10. So how do we get rid of the 10? Multiply both sides by 10. If your variable is on top, you are going to times in your calculator. And this is what you put in your calculator. 10 times sine 25. So seeing as this might be the first time you've ever done this with your calculator, get your little yellow guy. Okay? Type it just like you see it. 10 times. Right? The 10 button and then the times. Okay? And then there's a little button called trig. On your yellow school calculators, there's a button called trig. Press the button and you get 6 options. Okay? You get sine, cosine, tangent, and then you get some ones with minus ones. Okay, we're not going to use the minus ones until later, but you're going to hit the sine button. Okay, touch sine, and then you should see some parentheses come up. And inside of those parentheses, you're going to put 25. Now, here's another thing you need to be aware of. Okay? In the top right corner of your calculator, you might see some words. You might see the word rad, or you might see the word deg. Okay? These are two different types of angle measures. Rad stands for radians, and deg stands for degrees. Okay? And what is our angle measured in right now on our paper? Degrees, 25 degrees. So what we're going to have to do is add the little degree symbol to your calculation, and your calculator won't misunderstand it. Okay, if your calculator is in rad mode and you put a degree symbol, it will calculate it correctly. If you don't put a degree, it will give you the wrong answer. Okay, so if you're in rad mode and you press 10 sine 25, you're going to get negative 1.32. And of course, that's wrong. We can never have a negative side length. Okay, so how do you put in the degree button? Well, there's a little button down here with the, try the pi. Hit the pi button. So in the lower left corner, there's a pi button. And when you hit pi, you get some options. You get pi, and then there's a degree, and then there's an I, and then there's an R, and a G, and an infinity symbol. Wow. And an E, and a theta, and a, I don't know, whatever that is. So we want to hit the degree, okay? After you hit 25, tell the calculator we're talking about degrees. And your calculator will never misinterpret you ever, no matter what mode it's in. Okay? So when you do that and press enter, you get 4.226. So that is the side length of your triangle, 4.226. 4.226. Okay, example 2. Now we have our reference angle here. Okay, there's your reference angle. So what side is x? X is your hypotenuse. And what side is 60? The opposite side. Remember, the adjacent side touches your angle. So we do not know anything, nor do we care about your adjacent side. So we're only talking about your hypotenuse and your opposite side. So which trig relates your opposite and your hypotenuse? Hopefully you are learning that that's the sine ratio. The sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse. So opposite and hypotenuse, that's the sine. So we write sine of what angle? Sine of 50. Right, 50 is our angle. 50 degrees equals 60 over x. Opposite over hypotenuse. Okay, 60 over x. So now we have some algebra. Where is x? X is in your denominator. So how do we move x out of your denominator? We multiply both sides by x. Okay, we multiply both sides by x, and that cancels out x over there. So now we have x times the sine of 50. Okay, this is a number. I know it doesn't look like a number, but it's a number. X times the sine of 50 equals 60. So how do we get rid of multiplication? Right, this is multiplication. There's no plus there. How do we get rid of multiplication? Division. Division. So in our calculator, we're going to put it just like this. 60 divided by, hit your trig button, and then hit 50, and then hit your degree. Tell it we're talking about 50 degrees. Touch the degree button, right? That's under the pi symbol in the lower left corner of your screen. 60 divided by the sine of 50 in your calculator. 50 degrees. 60 divided by the sine of 50 degrees. Enter. And you should be getting 78.324. 78.324. Okay, let's move on. Here we have example 3. Our angle is 35. That's our reference angle. So what side does x represent? X is your adjacent side. And what side is 350? That's your opposite side. Okay, so now we don't know anything about or care about the hypotenuse, right? So which trig relates the opposite and the adjacent? That is the tan. So because we have the opposite and the adjacent, we use the tangent ratio. So what's our angle? 35. So the tangent of 35 equals opposite side, which is 350, divided by adjacent side, which is x. Okay, so opposite over adjacent. Whatever side is opposite, that goes on top. Whatever side is adjacent, that goes on bottom. Okay, so where is your variable? It's in the denominator. And when the variable is in the denominator, what operation do we do? We divide. Okay, the math steps are the same as it was in the previous example. You would multiply by x, right? You would multiply by x to get rid of x from your denominator, and then you would divide by tan 35. Okay, so you don't have to do the math over and over and over. The same thing is going to happen no matter what. So whenever your variable is in the denominator, you're going to end up dividing in your calculator. Number divided by trig. Okay, so let's finish out these last three examples here. This is, what side is x? X is the adjacent side, and 100 is the hypotenuse. So which trig relates the adjacent side and the hypotenuse? Okay, and that's the cosine. Adjacent side is x, hypotenuse is 100. So x over 100. Okay, and where is your variable now? It's on top. So if you want to find an on top, you're going to times. When your variable is on top, you times in your calculator. So 100 times the cosine of 44 degrees. Okay, when it goes into your calculator, you get 71.934. Okay, which better makes sense. The hypotenuse is the longest side, so you should be expecting something less than 100. Okay, and our last one, 80 is your angle. X is the adjacent side, and 23 is your hypotenuse. So once again, we're going to use the cosine ratio. The cosine of 80 degrees equals adjacent x over hypotenuse 23. Okay, so your variable is on top, so we're going to times in your calculator. 23 times the cosine of 80 degrees, which gives 3.994. Okay, so what we need to understand about trig is depending on which two sides you have, you're going to use a specific trig ratio for those two sides. If it's opposite and hypotenuse, that's the sine. If it's adjacent and hypotenuse, that's the cosine. And if it's opposite and adjacent, that's the tangent. Okay, so make sure that you are writing your ratios so we can see what you're doing, making sure you're using the correct ratios for the sides that you have. Okay, welcome to trigonometry. It might be the only thing you use for the rest of your life.